You know, sometimes the smallest projects teach us the biggest lessons about standing up for ourselves. This is the story of how building a simple garage became a battle for my basic rights as a homeowner, and how one neighbor's obsession nearly destroyed our entire community's peace. It started on what should have been a perfect Saturday morning. I'd been planning this garage renovation for over a year, saving up money, getting all my permits in order from the city. After 30 years of working with my hands, I finally had the time and resources to create the workshop I'd always dreamed of. The morning air was crisp. I felt that familiar satisfaction as my hammer found its rhythm thunk, 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 securing new siding panels to my detached garage. This wasn't just construction work. It was hope taking shape. A place where I could restore old furniture, fix neighbors' broken items, maybe even teach my grandkids some woodworking someday. But that peaceful morning shattered with a voice that could wake the dead. "Excuse me? Over there?" I turned to see my neighbor from across the street marching toward me like she was leading a cavalry charge. Now, I'd lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, and I knew Linda, let's call her. Linda had strong opinions about everything. Her yard looked like it belonged in a magazine, every blade of grass perfectly trimmed, every hedge sculpted to mathematical precision. "Good morning, Linda," I called out, trying to keep things neighborly, just working on expanding my garage into a proper workshop. She stopped at the edge of my driveway, and I could see her face was already flushed with indignation. "You can't. Just build whatever you want without getting approval from the Homeowners Association board. Don't you know there are procedures?" I set down my hammer and wiped my hands on my work shirt. "Linda, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not part of the HOA. My property was here long before the association was formed. I've got all my city permits right here in my truck if you'd like to see them." Her expression shifted from annoyance to disbelief, then to something that honestly worried me a little. "That's impossible. Every single house in this area falls under HOA jurisdiction. I should know I'm on the Architectural Review Committee." I could feel the temperature rising between us, but I tried to stay calm. "I understand the confusion, but my deed predates the HOA by about 10 years. Oh. You're more than welcome to check the county records if you'd like." Linda's face went from pink to red to nearly purple. "This is absolutely unacceptable. You think? You can just ignore the rules that the rest of us follow. Turn our beautiful neighborhood into some kind of industrial zone. It's just a garage, Linda, for woodworking. I'm not opening a factory." But she was already backing away, shaking her head. "We'll see about this. We'll just see." As I watched her storm back across the street, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. I'd dealt with difficult neighbors before, but something about Linda's reaction told me this wasn't going to end with a simple conversation. There was an intensity in her eyes that suggested this had become personal in a way I didn't quite understand yet. About an hour later, I was up on a ladder installing some trim when I heard sirens in the distance. My heart sank as a police cruiser turned into our cul-de-sac and pulled up right in front of my house. Linda practically sprinted out of her front door, waving her arms at the officer like she was flagging down a rescue helicopter. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This man is illegally constructing a building without proper authorization." The policeman stepped out of his car, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Ma'am, what exactly is the issue here? He's violating every construction regulation we have." Linda pointed at me like I was some kind of criminal mastermind. "I specifically told him he needs HOA approval and he refuses to comply." I climbed down from the ladder, my hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from frustration. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not part of her homeowners association. My property predates it." Linda let out what I can only describe as an indignant screech. "He's lying to you. Every property in this area is under association oversight. I've been on the committee for 8 years. I know the rules." Trying to figure out who was telling the truth? "Sir, do you have documentation to support what you're saying?" "Absolutely." I walked to my truck and pulled out the folder I'd prepared with my deed, survey, and all my city permits. My hands were steadier now. I knew I was in the right. The officer studied the documents carefully while Linda stood there with her arms crossed. "Looked up, ma'am. According to these documents, this property is not under HOA jurisdiction. It is all the proper city permits. There's no violation here." "That can't be right, those documents." You must have forged them somehow. Ma'am, the officer said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. These are official city documents with proper seals and stamps. Need to ask you to stop making false reports. This kind of call takes resources away from real emergencies. Linda looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. It wasn't just anger or embarrassment. It was something deeper, more personal, that belonged to her. This isn't over, she said quietly, her voice tight with controlled fury. Not by a long shot. As the police officer drove away, I stood in my driveway feeling like I'd just survived my first battle in a war I never wanted to fight. The worst part was I could feel the eyes of other neighbors watching from their windows, probably wondering what kind of drama was going to unfold next. I looked at my half-finished garage and made a decision that would define everything that came after. I wasn't backing down. This was my property, my dream, and my right as an American homeowner. But deep in my heart, I knew Linda wasn't the type to give up easily. And unfortunately, I wish I could tell you that after the police visit, Linda accepted reality, and we found a way to coexist peacefully. But some people, when they're convinced they're right, will double down on their convictions no matter what evidence you put in front of them. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy boots crunching across my gravel driveway. Through my bedroom window, I saw something that made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. Linda stood in front of my garage with 3 men in construction gear, pointing at my building like she was giving them military orders. I threw on clothes and rushed outside. Linda, what in the world is going on here? She turned to face me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a kind of smile people wear when they think they've outsmarted you. I've brought in professional compliance inspectors. Since you insist on building without proper oversight, we're going to ensure everything meets neighborhood standards. The tallest of the 3 men stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. Sir, we were contacted about reviewing this structure for HOA compliance. Stop right there, I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. I explained this yesterday to the police. I'm not in the HOA. You gentlemen have no authority on my property. And unless you have official paperwork from the city, you're trespassing. One of the contractors shifted nervously. If this property isn't under HOA jurisdiction, we really shouldn't. Linda whipped around to face him. Don't question me. I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years. I know what's what around here. I pulled out my phone. Gentlemen, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to leave my property before I call the police. Not for some made-up HOA violation, but for actual trespassing. The contractors looked at each other, then at Linda, then back at me. They were working men trying to make a living, and they could smell trouble from a mile away. We'll head out, the lead contractor said apologetically. Sorry for the confusion. As they packed up their tools and walked away, Linda's face went through about 5 different shades of red. Cowards. Fine. I'll handle this myself, Linda, I said, trying to inject some reason into the conversation. The police already confirmed yesterday that you have no authority here. Please, for both our sakes, just let this go. She stepped closer, and I could see something in her eyes that genuinely concerned me. This wasn't just about property values or neighborhood aesthetics anymore, and this had become personal in a way that seemed to consume her. You think you're so clever, she said, her voice dropping to an almost whisper. I've been protecting this neighborhood since before you even moved here. I won't let you destroy everything we've built. Over the next week, Linda launched what I can only describe as a campaign of harassment. Every morning, I'd find official-looking notices taped to my mailbox, fake violation warnings demanding I pay fines to an HOA I wasn't part of. She called the city inspection office so many times that the inspector started apologizing to me personally when he showed up. I'm really sorry about this, Inspector Rodriguez told me during his 3rd visit that week. Your permits are completely in order. Someone seems to have a personal issue with your project. But Linda wasn't just making phone calls. She started recruiting other neighbors. Going door to door with a clipboard and a story about how my garage was going to destroy property values. I could see her through my kitchen window, gesturing dramatically as she spoke to anyone who would listen. The worst part was watching how it affected the neighborhood dynamic. People who used to wave and chat were now giving me uncertain looks. Some neighbors started avoiding eye contact altogether. Linda was poisoning the well of community trust, one conversation at a time. Then came Friday evening. I was cleaning up my tools after another productive day when headlights swept across my driveway. Two police officers stepped out of their patrol car, and behind them came Linda, practically vibrating with vindicated energy. "There," she announced, pointing at me like I was a fugitive she'd finally tracked down. "I told you he was violating construction codes. Now you can finally shut this down." One of the officers approached with professional courtesy. "Sir, we received another complaint about unpermitted construction. I know this is probably frustrating, but we need to follow up on all reports." I nodded, resigned to the routine by now. "Of course, officer. Would you like to see my permits again?" As I laid out my documentation, city permits, deed records, inspection certificates, Linda hovered nearby, watching like she expected the papers to burst into flames and reveal themselves as forgeries. Officers reviewed everything thoroughly, then turned to Linda with expressions that suggested their patience was wearing thin. "Ma'am," the senior officer said carefully, "everything here is completely legal and properly permitted. This gentleman has every right to build his garage. More importantly, I need to tell you that filing repeated false reports is a serious matter." Linda's confident smile cracked. "False reports? I'm trying to protect our neighborhood? Isn't that what good citizens do?" "Good citizens don't waste police resources on personal disputes," the officer replied firmly. "If you continue making these calls, you could face charges for filing false reports. Do you understand?" The transformation in Linda's face was startling. The righteous certainty dissolved into something angrier and more desperate. "This is insane. You're supposed to be on my side. I pay your salaries." After the officers left, I sat on my porch steps, emotionally exhausted. This wasn't just about building a garage anymore. It was about one person's obsession threatening to tear apart the peaceful community. I'd called home for 15 years, but as I looked across the street and saw Linda pacing back and forth in her living room, silhouetted against her windows, I realized this was far from over. People like Linda don't retreat, they escalate, and the next morning proved just how right I was to be worried. Have you ever had one of those moments where you realize that reasonable people can become completely unreasonable when they feel their world is being threatened? That's the lesson I learned when I discovered what Linda had planned next. Saturday morning started peacefully enough. I was in my garage measuring lumber for some shelving when I heard the rumble of heavy trucks coming down our usually quiet street. Through the window, I watched 3 pickup trucks loaded with construction equipment pull up in front of my house, followed by a white van with property compliance solutions. Painted on the side, my stomach dropped. Linda emerged from her house, like a general reviewing troops, pointing and gesturing as workers began unloading lumber, orange cones, and rolls of caution tape. Neighbors were coming out of their houses now, drawn by the commotion. Some were filming with their phones. I walked outside as workers started setting up what looked like a construction barrier around my garage. "What do you think you're doing?" I called out. Linda turned to face me, holding a thick folder of papers against her chest like armor. "I'm exercising emergency authority as an HOA board member. This structure is being condemned as a safety hazard pending proper inspection and compliance review." I looked at the workers, who seemed as confused as I felt. You can't just declare someone's property condemned. That's not how any of this works. "Actually, I can." Linda opened her folder and pulled out what looked like an official document. "I have a quarter to demolition notice. Either you tear this down voluntarily, or these workers will handle it for you." I took the paper from her hands, and what I saw made my blood boil. It was obviously fake printed on regular office paper with a letterhead that looked like it was designed by someone's teenager. The judge's signature was so clearly forged it was almost comical. "Linda, this is fraud. This is actual criminal. Fraud. Do you understand what you've done?" Her confidence wavered for just a moment, but then she straightened her shoulders. "That's a legal document. You can't just ignore it because you don't like what it says." I held up the paper so the gathering neighbors could see it. "This is a fake court order. Look at it. There's no case number, no court seal, no legitimate signatures. This woman is trying to commit fraud in broad daylight."
One of the workers,
Middle-aged guy who looked like he'd been in construction for decades stepped closer to examine the document. His expression changed as he realized what he was looking at. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "this isn't a real court order. We can't proceed with demolition based on this." Linda's face went white, then red, then white again. "You're being paid to do a job. Do your job. We're being paid to follow legal demolition orders," the worker replied firmly. "This isn't legal. We're leaving." As the crew packed up their equipment and drove away, Linda stood in my driveway, shaking with rage. The neighbors who had gathered were whispering among themselves, and I could see the shock on their faces as they realized what they'd just witnessed. "You think you're so smart," Linda hissed at me. "You think you've won something here."
Ow, but you...
Embarrassed me in front of the entire neighborhood, and that's not something I'm going to forget. "Linda," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I didn't embarrass you. You embarrassed yourself. And if you ever try something like this again, I won't just call the police. I'll call a lawyer." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her eyes that genuinely frightened me. This wasn't just anger or frustration anymore. This was someone who had become so invested in being right. She was willing to break the law to prove her point. That evening, I found fake condemned signs nailed all over my garage, bright orange warnings that looked official from a distance, but fell apart under close inspection. No city seals, no legitimate contact information. Just more of Linda's desperate attempts to make her fantasy seem real, but it was the voicemail that really worried me. "You think you've won something?" Linda's voice crackled through my phone, speaker tight with controlled fury. "But you've made a big mistake. Nobody makes me look like a fool in my own neighborhood. Nobody. This is your last warning. Tear down that garage or I'll make sure you lose everything." I played the message 3 times, each time hearing more threat and less reason in her voice. This wasn't a neighbor dispute anymore. This was someone who had become completely unhinged, and I was the focus of her obsession. I called my son that night. He's a lawyer in the city, and played him the voicemail. "Dad," he said after a long pause, "this woman sounds dangerous." Phew. Need to be careful. People who make threats like this, sometimes they follow through. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside my window made me tense up, wondering if Linda was escalating again. I found myself checking the locks on my doors and windows, something I hadn't done since I was a kid, afraid of monsters in the closet. The irony wasn't lost. MYA was afraid of my neighbor, a woman I'd tried to be polite to, as someone who should have been part of my community's support system. Instead, she'd become the thing that made me feel unsafe in my own home. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on gravel outside my bedroom window, followed by the metallic sound of tools clinking together. My heart started racing as I realized that Linda's threats hadn't been empty words. She wasn't just trying to stop my garage project anymore. She was trying to destroy it with her own hands. There are moments in life when you have to choose between being a victim and being someone who stands up for what's right. As I listened to the sound of tools scraping against my garage at 2 in the morning, I realized this was one of those moments. Crept to my bedroom window and carefully parted the blinds. What I saw made my heart race and my hands shake with adrenaline. Linda was crouched next to my garage wall with a crowbar in her hands, trying to pry off the siding I'd spent weeks installing. She wasn't alone. Her teenage son held a flashlight, while another man I didn't recognize worked on the door lock with some kind of tool. They were trying to sabotage my garage under cover of darkness. I grabbed my phone and started recording, making sure to capture their faces in the flashlight. Beam. Linda was whispering urgently, "Hurry up before someone sees us. Once this thing is damaged, he'll have no choice but to tear it down completely." Her son sounded nervous. "Mom, this is crazy. What if we get caught?" "We won't get caught if you keep your mouth shut and hold that light steady." My hands were trembling as I dialed 911. "This is an emergency," I whispered to the dispatcher.
Gotcha.
"I have 3 people on my property right now, attempting to vandalize my garage. Please send officers immediately." The dispatcher assured me help was coming, and I stayed at the window, phone recording everything. Linda managed to pry loose one of my siding panels and tossed it on the ground with a satisfied grunt. The other man was making progress on the door lock. Then, like music to my ears, I heard sirens in the distance. Red and blue lights began flashing at the end of our street, growing brighter as two patrol cars approached. Linda froze with the crowbar still in her hands, her face caught perfectly in the beam of her son's flashlight. "No, no, no," she hissed. "Keep working." But her son had already dropped the flashlight and bolted toward the backyard. The other man, I later learned he was Linda's nephew, ran after him. Only Linda stayed frozen in place as the police officers jumped out of their cars. "Drop the weapon and put your hands where we can see them," one officer shouted. Linda let the crowbar clatter to the ground, but even caught red-handed, she couldn't help herself. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. I was checking this illegal structure for safety violations. It's dangerous." I stepped outside, still holding my phone. "Officers, I've been recording everything. This woman and her accomplices just spent the last 20 minutes trying to destroy my garage." The lead officer took my phone and watched several minutes of footage. His expression grew more serious with each passing second. "Ma'am," he said to Linda, "you're under arrest for vandalism, trespassing, and criminal mischief." As they handcuffed her, Linda's composure finally cracked completely. "You can't do this to me. I own this neighborhood. I've been protecting property values for 20 years. This man is the criminal, not me." Neighbors were coming out of their houses now, some in robes and slippers, drawn by the commotion. I saw people I'd lived near for 15 years watching in shock as Linda was placed in the back of a patrol car, still screaming about her rights and my supposed crimes. Her son and nephew were caught 2 blocks away and brought back in handcuffs. The sight of that teenage boy in tears, paying the price for his mother's obsession, was one of the saddest things I'd ever seen. The officers stayed with me for over an hour, documenting the damage, taking statements, assuring me that Linda would face serious charges. When they finally left, the street felt quiet in a way it hadn't been for months. But this time, the silence felt different, felt peaceful. The next few weeks brought a cascade of consequences that revealed just how deep Linda's problems ran. When the HOA learned about her arrest, they immediately distanced themselves and launched an investigation into her activities. What they found was shocking. Linda had been sending fake violation notices to dozens of neighbors over the years, collecting fines for violations she made up, and using the money for her own purposes. She'd been terrorizing people in our community for years, and everyone had been too intimidated to fight back. The city also took action, fining Linda thousands of dollars for repeatedly filing false reports and wasting municipal resources. Combined with her legal bills and the criminal charges, her finances collapsed quickly. 3 months later, I was working in my completed garage when I noticed a for sale sign go up in Linda's yard. The sight of that sign felt like the final chapter in a story that had consumed too much of our lives. The day the moving truck came, neighbors actually gathered outside to watch. Some brought lawn chairs and coffee. There was no celebration, exactly. But there was definitely a sense of collective relief as Linda's belongings were loaded up and driven away. Mr. Peterson from 2 houses down walked over to me that
afternoon
as I was sweeping sawdust from my garage floor. "You know," he said quietly, "I never thanked you for what you did." Linda sent me fake violation letters for 3 years, demanding I pay fines for the color of my shutters. I was too scared to fight her. But watching you stand up to her gave the rest of us courage. Mrs. Chen from across the street stopped by later with homemade cookies. "My English isn't perfect," she said with a smile, "but I understand bullies in any language. Thank you for showing us we didn't have to be afraid." As weeks passed, our neighborhood transformed in ways I never expected. People started talking to each other again. Kids played in yards without their parents, worrying about someone calling the HOA. The community potlucks that had died out during Linda's reign started up again. My garage became more than just a workshop. It became a symbol of what happens when ordinary people refuse to be bullied. Neighbors started stopping by to ask for help with projects, to borrow tools, or just to chat while I worked. 6 months after Linda left, I was teaching my 8-year-old grandson how to use a hand plane. In that garage, when he looked up at me with serious eyes, "Grandpa," he said, "why did that lady try to break your building?" I stopped what I was doing and knelt down to his level. Some people get so scared of change that they forget how to be kind to their neighbors. But the important thing is that we never stopped doing what was right, even when it was hard. He nodded solemnly, then went back to carefully shaving curls of wood with the plane. As I watched him work, I realized that Linda had actually given me something valuable, though she never intended to. She'd shown me and everyone in our neighborhood that standing up for yourself doesn't just protect your own rights, it protects everyone's rights. My garage still stands today, solid and proud, filled with the tools and projects that bring me joy. But more than that, it stands as proof that ordinary people can face down bullies and win, as long as they're willing to stand their ground and do what's right. And every time I park my truck inside those walls I built with my own hands, remember that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can change an entire community. The garage that Linda tried so hard to destroy became the foundation for something much stronger. A neighborhood where people look out for each other instead of tearing each other down. That's a legacy worth building, one board at a time.